All right, so this is our first session. I'm going to turn it over to Ray in a second. I just want to talk a little bit about, why we're here and the synergy. Ray would point out to me often that years and years ago, there were times when airports were begging taxis to come. It doesn't seem to be the case. It seems like the tail is wagging the dog these days, where a tremendous amount of business is. And when I started first delving into this world, not only do they have their own version of medallions at airports, and even though they don't view themselves, many of these airports, as regulators, one could make an argument that, well, maybe some of them are performing some regulatory functions. So, cab drivers are the first and last face that you see. They're usually at the airport. Some people call them ambassadors. It could make or break a city. I'm on the board of a nonprofit that does volunteer outreach for the tourism industry. And I can't tell you how catastrophic it could be that you have a wonderful flight on, Virgin Airlines and, or wherever in your first class, and you get out and then you go into some grungy taxi where there's a driver who is not polite and the seats are disgusting and they're ripping you off and overcharging you. That's the thing that causes people not to come back to your city. We used to see it in New York until we turned things around, and a lot of cities have turned things around and others haven't. I think the good news, in my view, is that cities are now realizing, and their tourism boards are getting more involved in issues, because if you want to bid on a Super Bowl, if you want to bid on a big event, or you just want your tourism industry to do better, you need to fix the cabs. And a lot of new mayors are taking over in cities where they're reforming things, and that's what's driving a lot of it. People are saying, the tourism industry, we need to get our hotels filled. We need to make sure that people come back. I can tell you, because I'm involved in this, that because I deal with people who visit the city of New York through the Big Apple Greeter nonprofit I'm involved in, we get chains of emails when people have bad cab experiences. And they don't come back, and they tell 10, 20 people. A big part of tourism is word of mouth. So this is very important. The synergies go without question. Both airports and taxi regulators and limousine regulators want the same thing: safe, efficient, customer-friendly, inexpensive taxi service. In some instances, airports do a better job, quite frankly, than regulators. And you go to an airport, it's a whole different cab experience. And we think that the trend is that there's more direct regulation of taxis on airport premises, replicating the work of regulatory licensing bodies. So Ray and I decided to do a survey of both the AGTA and the IATR. Oh, wow, it's working. Okay, much better. Now I have control. I feel better, Karen. Yeah, you just tell me when you want to jump in, Ray. I mean, we looked at a couple of different areas in our surveys. We looked at revenue. With the exception of, I think, New York and New Jersey and the Port Authority, most airport authorities around the country have a revenue base to generate from the access permitted for taxis on their premises. There are franchise agreements, which Ray is going to talk a little bit about in the next slide. There are fines and penalties. There are many regulations. Take a look at some of the airport regulations. There is detailed as taxi and limo regulations, whether it's a PUC or a taxi commission. There's also the issue of the controversial issue of open versus closed entry. Some airports are closed. You need to apply to get a permit. You need to meet certain standards to get in, just like certain cities, until recently, have closed markets. They have environmental goals. They have complaint systems. They have training. They have very intricate GPS dispatch systems that track who comes in, limos and taxis into the airports. And in terms of safety, airports and regulators both require criminal background checks, drug testing, security cameras, and there are rules for driver misconduct. Now I'm going to turn it over to Ray, who's going to talk a little bit about his expertise, which is the franchise and concession agreements and the process. Ray?
Okay. Just briefly, airports have, as I said earlier, had a different sort of mission. Airports have to ensure that arriving customers and their customers literally have safe services, quality services, and, if you will, services at the lowest possible price, if you will, in terms of providing that service to the airport. It is up to them to make sure that the taxi cab company, the shared ride van company, the bus companies, others that are serving that airport literally live up to certain standards. And we have, I look back and I do have them with me, we had developed standards for both our taxi cab services and our shared ride services all the way back in 2005. I looked at those again and they seem to still be pretty much in place with age of vehicle, driver uniform, age of driver, knowledge of the area. Those are the sorts of things that we require of a good taxi service at an airport. And over the years, we have gone more and more toward the franchise model, if you will, or some way of saying, I'm going to phrase this the right way. I'm used to speaking to either the IATR group or my airport group, so suddenly I find myself in between talking to both of them at the same time, trying to make sure that I don't offend, and I probably will offend both sides at the same time. Literally, at the airport, a lot of our airports feel that regulatory agencies over the last decade or two within the cities have sort of allowed the use of independent contractors to become an excuse for not managing the taxi cab services. And you find a general trend in North America, especially in the States, in the lower 48 as they're called, to basically go to a single call center cab company that's providing the majority of the call business. Their drivers literally take their dispatch calls, they go and try to get 15, 20, 25 trips a day, working all the different markets. On the other hand, you may have people that have permits, either they drive them themselves or they're simply re-releasing what I call a non-value added permit to other drivers, and they have no dispatch, and we get them all at the airport. And that creates a problem. It creates a problem of mass, it creates a problem of people sitting around 3 and 4 hours, and puts a lot of pressure on airports to have minimum fares from the airport because they had to wait. You can imagine walking into a grocery store and saying, well, that stick of gum or that soda is going to cost you $10 as a minimum because our clerk had to wait 3 or 4 hours before they sold anything. We think that's absolutely ridiculous. Literally, airports should be the premium, most generated service spot in the area, if you will, and in many cases, there's just no reason for that if it's managed properly. I think somewhat fed up with poor services, airports have decided to try to minimize that buildup of cabs at the airport, yet ensure that those cabs will be there when they're needed, in going to either a franchise model that says, look, we're going to have new cabs, or cabs on the average are no older than 2 years. We're going to have at least some sort of uniformed drivers, and we are going to have services in which if you are a bad apple, if you're a bad actor, you turn down if you will, fares, we're going to get rid of you. I do think airports have gotten tougher and have been allowed to by their boards than, shall we say, the regulatory agencies, and they have been allowed to by their city councils. I think you'll find that more and more we're using exclusive use fee to the airport as a way in which we are managing our ground transportation with respect to taxi cabs, and we have been pretty much with respect to shared ride van service. We believe in the concessioned airport for both revenue, that is, most airports have their authority which says they have to be self-sufficient, and that they are beginning to treat the taxi operation as a concession like anything else. It will contribute to its cost. Most landside managers in airport ground transportation will tell you that they spend 95% of their time dealing with taxi issues and only 5% of their time dealing with the other buses, shared ride vans in many communities. So in essence, most of their costs are attributed to taxi cabs, and they need to at least recover that cost. Most concessions at the airport recover their cost and make a contribution to the running of the airport, and I think that is inherent in many of these concession agreements. The exclusive pickup, and I disagreed a little bit with one of the slides that we had here, you have two kinds of services in taxi cab industry and in the shared ride. You have the on-demand, that is, they can wait there and pick up, typically known as the taxi line, but then you have prearranged. Most airports have a system whereby, well, I should say, anybody can pick up under a prearranged basis. It's the right of the airline traveling passenger to be picked up by any commercial vehicle of their choice or private vehicle, and it's that right which sort of translates to the commercial operator that says that you can come and operate at our airport under a prearranged condition, which will be interesting to see, just to heighten up the conference a little bit, how airports are going to handle the new app entries into the marketplace. How are we going to handle those people that come to the airport to pick up? Are we going to treat them the same way, or special requirements? Those are typically prearranged trips, and we do have methodologies for paying for using them. On the other end, though, we do, I think, as a group, and I'm speaking for airports probably at large, but I think most airports prefer to have the concessioned approach because of the control element that it allows them. I'm going to let Matt go over the examples that we found in the survey of different airports and the different approaches they use.
Thanks, Ray. So one example is Baltimore Washington Airport, which has a franchise agreement, had it in place for its taxis for the last 20 years. The purpose was to establish a high level of customer service, ensure a supply of taxis that's adequate, and ensure consistent vehicle aesthetics. The standards are different from those outlined by the Maryland PSC. I think Maryland PSC is here, right? Yes, hello. Which regulates taxis and limos in the state. So there's higher customer service standards in franchise agreements than in the Maryland Code. That's not to take anything away from the good work of the PSC, but I mean, it does give you a little bit more flexibility to impose upon a franchisee things that maybe politically you can't get done at an agency level. So, you know, some of the things that we found from the survey, the benefits and the issues and some downsides, really, of the taxi regulator and the host city is, you know, there are enhanced rules that benefit safety and service to supplement regulatory efforts. Regulations that cannot be politically accomplished by the regulator can be by an independent airport. The airports are independent. They don't have these boards and commissions where people are lobbied. I'm not to say that...
That may be an overstatement, Matt. I think airports would say they had some pretty lobbied aviation directors.
I think you'd agree that the dynamic could be a little different. I think I'd get more accomplished at an airport, but maybe I'm just, I don't know, maybe I'm off kilter.
It's not quite as public as city council, but there's pressure there.
And there's a different level of politics as well. Like, you know, for instance, in the Port Authority, New York and New Jersey, you have two governors who every once in a while, you know, have an agreement to pick the person who's going to run it, and it's a quasi-public entity. So the same procurement and oversight that exists for city agencies or mayoral agencies is not necessarily there, I would assume, in a lot of airports. You know, potential issues and the downside is, of course, the industry doesn't like fines, fees, and you know, more regulation in general if it's onerous. Strained relations with the taxi regulator. Two classes of vehicles and drivers, you know, could develop. One set servicing the airports, one set servicing areas outside the airports. And, you know, confusion. You know, there's a lot of synergy, but there's also different sets of regulations outside the airports. And for someone who's running a business to have to keep track of it, it's almost like operating in certain counties around the country, like in Nassau and Suffolk County, you know, or at least in Suffolk County, New York. You know, you have to, if you're operating a business, you have to get permits in 4 or 5 different towns. You can imagine the frustration that industry folks have. So in 2012, we worked with the AGTA to administer a survey to 20 airport ground transportation entities. Second part of the survey was, after getting responses from the airports, is going to those regulators, those targeted regulators in those various cities. And we had about 30 questions, which we won't go into all of them here, but it governed not just the nature of the regulations and their biggest issues and concerns and priorities and challenges that they're facing, but also talked a little bit about like what their working relationships are like. Are they working together well, or do they have contact, and how frequent? We'll make, you know, we have detailed results of the survey, which we can make available after the conference if you want to go line by line, if it interests you. So, yeah, that was it, basically. We wanted to compare and contrast. We wanted to identify issues for further academic study. Ray and I and our organizations will be at some point publishing some type of paper that relays the results of the survey. And we're hoping with folks like transportation centers and academics will find value in it and maybe pick up different areas to focus on. Maybe someone will do a paper and analyze the permit system and if it's working, and what's the synergy like with on certain issues, maybe refusals, and what's a refusal like, and can overcharging be addressed if at both levels. I mean, really the sky's the limit when it comes to different things that we can do. So this comes as no surprise. I mean, we found 4 different scenarios when we asked the question of people working together. There are those who partner, and we have our IATR board chairman, Tom Drischel, is going to come up to the next panel. He has the benefit of having also worked at LAX, but has a great relationship with them now for all the years he's been at the DOT in LA. And, they have a relationship, which we'll talk about, where they share regulations that they're doing and working on before they actually go public, which I think is very productive. And you have the independent approach, which, putting it politely, is, the hell with you, I'm doing my own thing. And then you have the approach where the city takes the lead and the airport follows, and vice versa, the airport takes the lead. A good example, the partnership approach, in addition to LA, of course, is San Antonio, Texas. The city issues city permits and airport permits. And some of the speakers that, we have an interesting mix, and Ray will help introduce them as well in terms of why we selected them. You're going to see a lot of different approaches to how they regulate airports and who has responsibility. The airport and city have contact 1 to 2 times per week. I don't think I had contact with my chief of staff, Ira Goldstein, for more than once or twice a week. No, we're just kidding. San Antonio, Texas. City regulations are the same as airport regulations, with the exception of credit cards. They're mandated by the city, but not the airport. And this is the type of stuff the survey went into. There's the vehicle age limit for vehicles that are allowed on airport premises is 7 years versus 8 years for the city, outside the airport. So you can see exactly what I'm talking about. There's a $250,000 minimum liability insurance at the airport versus a 30, 60, 25 minimum liability. I think that means 30 per person, 60 per occurrence, and 25 is most likely either property damage or no fault, I'm not sure. Physical exams of drivers and refresher training are required by the city, but not at the airport. Both the city and the airport have a role in setting taxi cab fares. The airport can collect revenue from city-regulated ground transportation through departure access fees, and complaint information is submitted to the city and airport respectively. They share the information. So there's not 2 sets of books. So it's obvious, it's good, and there's benefits to the partnership approach. There's consistent regulation that allows ground transportation providers to meet city and airport standards with minimal additional cost. The cons may be difficult to implement and maintain in a larger market. And the question of whether the city and the airport have an equal say in the promulgation of new standards and regulations could very well, I think, depend on the personalities involved as well. Did somebody cross somebody else in a prior life? Do people get along? I mean, that's a question for the millennium, for the ages. Minneapolis, Minnesota. This is an example of the independent approach. And we have some folks here, right, from Minneapolis? Where are they? Hiding? In the back? There you are. The Metropolitan Airports Commission regulates airport taxis. They provide coordinated aviation services throughout the Twin Cities metro area, particularly at Minneapolis-St. Paul Airport. MAC regulates all taxi cabs and has on its premises and has its own taxi rules, regulations, and driver handbook. The city taxi regulations are done by the Licensing and Consumer Services Division of the City of Minneapolis, and they regulate taxis and drivers within the City of Minneapolis. 2 very different systems, and we've analyzed these rules, and talked about them at prior AGTA conferences. 2 very different set of books. Taxis are licensed by MAC are not required to be licensed by any other regulatory body. Just a little snapshot. Vehicle age, MSP and Minneapolis both have no more than 6 years old that's allowed on the road in terms of taxis. The minimum liability occurrence is 200, 600, and 1 million. Minneapolis, the fuel efficiency standards, and you can see the in-vehicle safety and the driving standards. One thing which is interesting is this differentiation, the criminal background checks, for those who are interested in that. MSP prohibits any misdemeanor conviction in 5 years, and the city prohibits serious misdemeanors in the last 3 years. California Public Utilities Commission this week ruled that it's okay to be a felon regardless of how serious the crime is, as long as it was not more than 7 years ago. So, mass murderers and people who, done really bad things, you can drive and do a ride share now, so good luck to you. I couldn't help, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Ray, I'm off topic. Minneapolis, Minnesota. We're getting a little bit on time, but this is really rich stuff. I encourage you to talk to the folks in Minneapolis. This is there's so much detail in their regs, and there's a lot of different issues. But there are also things that some do that the others don't. Like MSP has regulations against discrimination and prohibiting cell phones, while the other entity does not. So they are aligning their standards. They are working together now, but it is an example of two systems that kind of operated independently for a while. San Francisco, I don't know how we are for time. SFO and the MTA, we covered this as well. Salt Lake, maybe Ray, you want to talk a little bit about Salt Lake?
Well, in the interest of time, I'll just speak from here because Larry Bowers from Salt Lake is going to present a little later on in the program. But to my knowledge, it's the only airport that actually manages the regulatory aspects for ground transportation for the entire city. There's some background of how it led up to that, but Larry will go over that and how they manage it from an airport point of view.
And it's certainly a good example of the airport lead approach, and we might want to call it the airport control approach. And our friends from Abu Dhabi have explained to me that they basically control the taxis outside and inside the airports, and they have the authority to give a franchise to a separate entity. So that's a whole other approach, which is very unique. I'll end it on time by talking about just some of the different responses that we got when we asked the airports in the cities to prioritize their issues and problems. And you could see, this is the purple is cities and the orange is airports. And we'll just go right down the line here. It looks like airports that we surveyed are reporting that they've had bigger issues with refusals than cities. Cities have said that basically the cab drivers are slightly more discourteous outside the airports than they are inside of the airports. Same thing goes for overcharging. When it comes to unlicensed activity and illegal solicitation, they were both kind of equal in their responses. And the same goes for traffic violations. In terms of other general issues, airports actually reported a little bit of a higher concern or issue with driver misconduct. Illegal solicitation outside the airport's a little bit higher. A big disparity between dispatch issues and a big disparity between wheelchair access, where the cities reported as a much bigger problem than at the airports. Same thing goes for vehicle conditions. So that's just really a sampling. It is what it is. It kind of just scratches the surface of how various airports and taxi regulators are either working or not working with each other, how they view things. But you can see that they have all the same issues for the most part. Maybe some are less of a priority on the premises or off the premises of an airport, but it's the same stuff. And I thought this was fascinating because for years and years and years, I had no idea that these airports had their own regulations. It was something that I thought was very interesting. I think it's worthy for the academics and the research committees, the folks in the room. I think it's a great area of further research and study. I think all of us would benefit from that. Obviously, I think we can both say we feel the partnership approach is probably the best approach. But hey, if you can have an airport or city control approach and you guys work well together, I've always felt that it's better to have one boss than two bosses. It makes life a little bit easier. You know who you're serving, so there's some benefit to the other side. So cooperation is key. That's why we're here. We're here to talk and communicate. I want to thank all the folks who, it was a pretty long survey, so I want to thank everybody in Ray's organization, also at the IATR, or as Ray says, IATR, who it actually grew on me. I want to start calling it IATR, or I don't want to call you guys AGTA. Doesn't really sound.
Well, we get called that all the time,
AGTA?
among other things.
I like the way it sounds. Anyway, well, thank you.
Matt, let me add just one
Sure.
thing in conclusion. As we did the survey, what you really come down to is that both the objectives of a city and the objectives of an airport are the same, and that's to have a good, high-quality service. I think both the cities and the airports want to have a job that is worth it for the driver. One of the things when you realize when you're managing either an airport or you're regulating for a city, you're affecting the lives of thousands of drivers. And your job, in many cases, is to try to develop a strategy that has the kind of system that attracts capital, good management, good drivers, low turnover rate, and ones that people in the community are actually proud of. That's a difficult challenge. The taxi industry today, as we face it here, and I'm not talking about shared ride, I'm just talking about taxi in this case, is being severely threatened. That model we have developed over the last couple of decades is being impinged upon from a number of different areas, and I don't think this current model will survive. It will change, and it's a tremendous effort now by regulatory agencies to go from where they are into this new millennium with respect to social media and what's going to happen in the future. So it's a great challenge. It's a good time for us to talk about it.
Can I ask you a question, Ray? Just the history of airports as they developed, have there been instances where taxi regulation has been so horrific and an inability for taxi government entities to regulate it, or mayors that they just told the airport, you know what, why don't you guys just handle this, take the whole thing over? And if that's happened before, how often, and do you think that's something that could happen in the future as cities start to deregulate somewhat for smartphones, and when order gets reestablished, is it possible that airports might just basically take over and just take over the whole thing, or is that a crazy idea?
As I said, Larry Bowers will be here to talk about Salt Lake, and I don't see that as a trend. I really don't. Airports in general don't really want to manage the cities, I would think. I'm not speaking, I don't think I'm speaking out of turn when I say our airport landside folks have enough on their plate.
Right.
They really don't want to be the regulators for the entire city.
Right.
I do think the cities, on the other hand, are looking more and more at the franchise approach as a way to say, look, what we're doing isn't working. If you don't have an investment wrapped up in medallions, that makes it almost impossible to change the model. If you have the opportunity and City Council understands the alternatives, you'll find more and more cities going towards some sort of franchise approach and trying to clean up what's become a just unfortunate action in many cases for their drivers and for the riding public.
Okay. All right. On that note, we are actually on time.